This is an IWP media production, brought to you by the Institute of World Politics, the independent graduate school empowering the next generation of national security, intelligence, and international affairs experts. Learn from top scholar practitioners and acquire invaluable skills to propel your career. To learn more, visit iwp.edu.
Welcome to the IWP Podcast. My name is Ashton Earl. I'm the Director of Graduate Recruitment here. Quick, for those who haven't been introduced to IWP yet, or this is their first time listening in, the Institute of World Politics is a graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs. We train practitioners entering those fields, specifically for the United States government and some of its allies. So with that, we'll get started today. We're going to have a pretty lengthy discussion on Africa with two seasoned Africanists. I'll introduce them now. First is, to my left, Charles Snyder. Professor Snyder teaches a course here on U.S. Africa policy, a deep dive from his experience and his background. He served as a consultant on Africa affairs for various DoD and private entities since retiring in October 2013. He's also lectured on Africa for the Joint Forces Staff College and the JFK Special Warfare Center. Before that, Mr. Snyder served as Senior Advisor to State Department's International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau from 2011 until retiring in 2013. Previously, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Civilian Police in African, Asian, European, and Middle East programs in the same bureau from 2007 to 2011. He provided program and policy direction for civilian police, anti-crime, and counter-narcotics assistance programs totaling over $1 billion. During this period, he oversaw the launch of new programs in Lebanon and the West Bank. He also developed and initiated the International Police Peacekeeping Operations Support Program, or IPOS. I don't know if I'm... IPOS? Yeah, perfect. As well as the International Police Education Training Program. Before moving to INL, Mr. Snyder served as a department senior representative on Sudan until January 2006. He was charged with guiding the policy and operations associated with bringing the Navaisha. Thank you. Peace Accords to fruition. Mr. Snyder served for 8 months as acting Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs until July 2004 and was responsible for setting U.S. policy toward Africa while managing a bureau with 48 constituent posts and over 4,000 employees. Earlier, while serving as Principal Deputy and Deputy Assistant Secretary from 2001 to 2003, he was policy point person for the Sudan Peace Initiative and framed policy toward East and Central Africa. Previously, from 1995 to 2001, as Director of the Office of Regional Affairs in the Africa Bureau, he supported the Assistant Secretary on cross-cutting policy and program issues including democracy, conflict resolution, human rights, labor, multilateral organizations, public affairs, congressional affairs, and crisis management. Small portfolio there.
Easy to...
Right. A career intelligence officer and Africanist, he served as the National Intelligence Officer for Africa from 1992 until April 1995. During this period, he supervised the production of several national intelligence estimates on Africa, including a major review of the continental prospects and problems, as well as a detailed forecast of the potential impact of HIV or AIDS. Earlier, as Senior Political Military Advisor to the Africa Bureau, he served on the team which mediated the tripartite agreement between Cuba, Angola, and South Africa, led the Joint Military Monitoring Commission which implemented the ceasefire along the Angola-Nambia border, co-chaired the military discussions supporting the Portuguese mediation of the Angolan Civil War, and led the U.S. technical team supporting the successful Italian effort to negotiate an end to the Mozambican Civil War. Lieutenant Colonel Snyder retired from the U.S. Army in 1991 after serving for 22 years. During that career, he was responsible to the Army Deputy Chief of Staff for operations for all African military training and security assistance programs, as well as programs for Egypt, Lebanon, and Israel. He was assigned to the State Department in 1985 and served as military advisor to the Africa Bureau until retirement. He received a bachelor's degree in economics from Fordham University, a Master of Business Administration and International Finance from American University, and did postgraduate work in international relations at Catholic and Howard Universities. He is a fellow of the Inter-University Seminar on Armed Forces Security, a distinguished visiting lecturer of the Foreign Service Institute, and a life member of the Foreign Area Officers Association and African Studies Association. It's part one. Is there more?
Proves I'm old.
Fair enough. Well, Paul's... not to say there was less experience there, but it's not 8 paragraphs. Right. So Paul Kepp to my right. He teaches a course here on intelligence in Africa, a complementary course to what Dr. Snyder teaches, which he's running now for the first time. Before he joined us, Paul was with the Central Intelligence Agency for a little under 3 decades, mainly focused on Africa. Paul was the chief of operations on the African continent. He was a chief of station 5 times in Africa and in other regions, as well as the assistant director of CIA for South and Southeast Asia. So anything you want to add to that?
No,
let me know. Okay.
I did more stuff than I did.
Well, we'll find out. We got a few hours to flesh that out, I think. So first and foremost, talking about Africa, I think that the general American population doesn't necessarily pay close attention to it. I think it's easy to even say that about many entities within the federal government that maybe should be focusing more on Africa. So the first question, it's broad, and so you guys can take this however you want. Why does Africa matter? What is it to the United States? What role does it play within the national security and foreign policy framework? And I think we'll just open it up with that. And I don't know, Paul, you want to take a stab at it first?
Sure. I'll be happy to. I mean, Africa is rarely a front burner issue. There have been a few things over the years, the fall of apartheid, the Rwanda genocide, famine in Ethiopia, that have forced themselves onto the front pages in the United States. But it's rarely at the top of the list. Nevertheless, it's an important continent. It's the second largest continent in the world by size. It has a large and growing population. It is a continent that's blessed or cursed. I think both are true, with a tremendous quantity of natural resources, many of which are important to the United States now. It's also a theater that over the years, and this continues up to the present, has been a stage for competition and conflict with other global powers. The Soviet Union, now Russia, China. There's growing interest in the continent by some important allies of the United States, just Turkey and the Gulf states. They're more interested there. And arguably, it was the birthplace of Al-Qaeda. And I think the first shots in the global war on terror were fired even before 9/11 in Africa. And terrorism remains a vitally important issue for the United States. And Africa is a place where that continues to be an issue.
Sure. Dr. Snyder, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think Paul's exactly right. I think that looking forward, that we have to accept some African realities. It's kind of a vast, uncontrolled space, which of course makes it dangerous for us on a number of scores. One, as it points out, the rise of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups that could reach to the United States. As you may or may not recall, it was Sudanese elements that attacked the World Trade Center before the big explosion, in there earlier than almost by a decade. The other thing to remember is that there is going to be an explosive population growth in Africa. It will have about 25 to 30% of the world's population. You just can't ignore that market, that potential labor source, etc. It's also home, like it or not, to vast quantities of critical minerals needed for highly specialized things, including smaller things like Teslas.
Right.
The only other source of many of these minerals is China itself. The only capacity to refine a lot of these is in China now. So we're threatened on 2 fronts right now with potential critical mineral shortages. You may have seen in the press, one of the responses to President Trump's tariffs is the Chinese imposing barriers on the shipment of critical minerals back to the United States.
Right.
The minerals won't move, which means we're by definition interested in Africa in the longer run. And then if we go back into international diplomacy, they have a huge number of votes, 54 if you count the whole continent, in the UN and other places. And depending on what you're trying to achieve, those votes can be important. Now you're used to shield the worst abuses of Russia and China on the human relations side of things, humanitarian assistance and so on.
That you bring up a really interesting point. The idea that Africa for lack of a better term, can be kind of the Wild West as far as international affairs is concerned. That I've heard in some instances that changes the way that a lot of great power competitors or even rising competitors tend to operate, in a way that maybe the way that they operate in Africa brings greater clarity to the way that they would operate anywhere else, just because there's less of a accountability concern there. Have you guys seen that to be the case? Does that make sense, that question?
Yeah, I think it does make sense. And I think perhaps one example of that that's going on right now is the way Russia has re-engaged with Africa after a period of stasis after the end of the Cold War. And that's through the use of these private paramilitary companies like Wagner. Wagner and Russia's presence in the Sahel and in the Central African Republic, I think, very much reflects that kind of strong arm approach to international diplomacy, and you see it playing out very clearly in Africa, for better or for worse, in the Sahel and in other countries in Africa.
Right, arguably in ways that they wouldn't operate in other continents.
No. I would say I haven't seen that. Charlie, I don't know if you have anything to add. I haven't seen that as clearly evident anywhere else in the world.
Okay. Do you feel like, further along that trend, do you feel like that gives the United States a more accurate glimpse of what the reality is for, you just brought up the Russians. So, if they're hiding their ambitions and some of their things in other continents, obviously, maybe launching a full-scale war in Ukraine wasn't one of those instances, but in other cases where the intentions of that group or that country may be more veiled, do you feel like the United States can credibly assess what they're doing in Africa as maybe more indicative of what their true intentions are?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's more indicative. It's just one theater on the world stage, which, because it is such a diverse continent where there is so much conflict, ungoverned space, it is an interesting area to observe how countries, including the United States, respond to conditions like that, respond to threats, challenges, and opportunities.
Sure.
And I don't think there's any continent in the world that has quite that level of diversity and change and conflict as you see in Africa.
Sure.
Oh, good. To look at the Russia and China operating in this sphere now, I think you're seeing the Russians being opportunistic. They're filling a vacuum in places with its chaos, etc., to acquire things that the old Soviet Union might have wanted, a port and that kind of thing. They're more opportunistic. The Chinese are being strategic, and they've been strategic since they engaged. I don't think the full plan was even revealed until very recently. But if you look at the beginnings of the Belt and Road Initiative, which some of us, including me, laughed at a bit as wildly ambitious, and suddenly you look at Africa now, the continent is literally surrounded by Chinese ports, Chinese access, Chinese roads, Chinese railroads in some places. Certainly China Incorporated is in there in large numbers. And it's part of a strategic plan that's now coming to fruition. The first base anywhere outside of China, and outside the South China Sea as well, is in Djibouti, right next to the rest of us. And there are rumors of at least a second base being developed. But in either case, the Chinese are present in so many strategic areas, ports in particular, that they're there. Right. They could easily, and at time of crisis, do something about it. They've also begun to buy up, or at least engage in ways to get the critical minerals, etc. It's wonderful to have access to the minerals, but if you can't get them out, they're no good to you. And so you see the Chinese, I think, beginning to engage more in that kind of infrastructure development. So I think there's a difference there. For instance, the Chinese, for the first time, deployed peacekeepers in large numbers in Africa. Why did they do that? They did that to get familiarity with the area. They've employed as many as 30,000 troops in the peacekeeping arena. We employ troops in onesies and twosies, partly because our troops are always threatened in these arrangements. The Soviets don't supply, the Russians don't supply troops either. The Chinese do, and they did it to get a feel for the continent. That's where their peacekeepers went. And the Chinese have developed very quietly at least 2 professional military companies, both of which are operating on the West Coast right now. Are they front page Wagner kinds of things, or the new Africa Corps. No, but they're there. And they're there for the practical reason that they need to protect Chinese assets and Chinese personnel.
Right. I think China and Russia are going to be a reoccurring theme throughout this conversation, especially as the United States tries to address the new reality of a great power competition with actual near-peer threats in Africa, not necessarily neatly falling into any of the spheres of influence or the regional hegemonies that people tend to want to cluster them into. You mentioned that the Chinese are building infrastructure, specifically ports and things of that nature. One of the United States' core strategic interests for centuries now has been controlling sea lines communication or maritime choke points. Is that something that your assessment is that the Chinese are following? We know they're reading Mahan. We know they're reading all of our original strategic thinkers, and they seem to be kind of copying and pasting to whatever effect. The effect we can only anticipate will be similar to what we experienced during Pax Americana. Are they just shotgunning whatever lands in Africa? And, if they'll let me build a port, whether it's near whether it's in a Great Lake or actually on sea line communication, or are they really narrowly targeting certain strategic interests of theirs?
I think you can make the case that it's strategic in the sense that they're looking for redundancy. They're in an awful lot of places. But if you've done Africa as long as some of us have, Paul and I have, things change politically over time. And you may not have access in one place that you thought you had, but yet you got redundancy somewhere else. And I think that's one of the things that this Road and Belt Initiative is doing, that they spread out so far that they can have redundancy when they need it. And I think the sea lines of communication, as you brought up, is essential to them for the Chinese economic miracle to have happened, and that's debatable. But nonetheless, the intensity of their economy depends on raw resources, but also the ability to ship out manufactured products, and mostly Chinese bottoms, etc. And so the sea lines of communication are important to them. The movement up the West Coast indicates that this particular movement is not over yet.
Sure.
And securing a South Atlantic sea line had to be a pipe dream when they started this. And now they're beginning to look at that. I would argue beginning to look at that kind of thing.
Sure. Makes sense. This is a lot of what's happening, I think, is indicative of things that have happened in the past, in both of your careers. Both of you served during periods of the Cold War. Part of why Africa matters, and I think what you've said, is that it influences our relations with great powers and others that are from across the world. Do you think that would you say that it had a poignant enough effect or a important enough effect on U.S. relations with these nations that it's worth continuing to consider integration with Africa, U.S. strategic integration with Africa? Or is this something that you feel like was unnecessary and just kind of was a coincidence that it happened to be Africa was kind of brought into some of these major decisions that were made in the Cold War and these major relational avenues that were developed with Russia and China and other groups?
Well, I think we have dropped the Cold War ideological combat mentality that we had, where we felt compelled to respond because the Soviets were expanding, or later the Chinese were expanding. And we've gotten down more to the business of America as business, if you will, and where that relationship is important: access to markets, etc., access to the materials for our own manufacture, access to critical materials for defense products, etc. You're going to see us be more competitive. But that's very different than challenging them at every step because they're communists. We're now challenging them, if you want, because they're mercantilist in the Chinese case. But that dynamic is there. And it's attracted the attention of the emerging powers as well. As Paul mentioned earlier, there are new players. So suddenly Turkey is busy down in this area trying to secure its access, etc. Because its products at the stage of development Turkey is are more naturally sold in Africa. It's the early version of the microwave, not the soup to nuts that Siri runs, right. Version of the microwave, that kind of idea. And on a strategic front, the Indians have woken up to the fact that it's the Indian Ocean. And then yet they have no bases, etc., beyond the immediate periphery. We're seeing them start to explore base options further out in places like Mauritius, and there's rumors in the Seychelles, there's rumors in Tanzania, etc. And they're now participating for the first time in some of these African naval activities that go on. So the Indians have woken up to the fact that there's something going on here. And we'll have to see how that develops. They don't have the wherewithal right now to make a big difference. Right. The Japanese are about to have a conference in August, the one TCAD as they call it, which is a big deal for Japanese businessmen, etc. And it's a big deal. The heads of state are literally brought to Tokyo, and they have access to the highest people in the Japanese government while they discuss these things. And the Japanese aid program, smaller than most, really reinforces their business interests, right? As I think ours is beginning to revolve in that direction as well. So there are new players coming in, and I think the struggle is over things, people, and access, as opposed to you're a damn communist or you're something else or an Al-Qaeda terrorist, etc.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's important to note that whatever the issue is, whether it's resources, whether it is ideology, whatever remnants there might be of that in Africa, whether it's the struggle against terrorism, I think it is important to maintain expertise on the African continent. It may seem a little counterintuitive at first glance to say this, but certainly in my experience, I found that people were most effective, even on global issues that stretch beyond Africa, if you're pursuing those objectives, defending those interests in Africa. Expertise on Africa is what led to success. I'm not in any way denigrating the need for profound expertise on China or Russia or other issues, but to the extent that these challenges are addressed in Africa, including on terrorism, I found the people that were most effective were those who understood Africa, its issues, its history, its culture, and the general dynamic there, where these contests are being carried out. Sure. And I think that argues for the U.S. government, as long as we maintain the ambition to be a global power, and I don't see that changing, Africa will be a part of that, and maintaining a cadre of experts and expertise in general on the continent is important.
That makes sense. It begs the question, what exactly we're doing about that. And there's obviously the last few months, there's been some fairly impactful, I think you could say, changes in the way that the government does business in Africa, the way the government builds relations with African states. The most recent one of those is a rumor that perhaps we're going to start closing some African embassies. That I think there's a list of 5 that included South Sudan, included Eritrea, included, I believe it was Gambia, and Lesotho. I believe there's one more, but it's not coming to mind. Is that something that, one, I guess I want you guys' take on that. Is that something that is wise or makes sense or it has any precedent beforehand? And 2, what are the implications of removing ourselves from having a specific diplomatic presence in all of these countries?
I think it does depend to some extent on the country. And there are places, we'll take Eritrea as an example. Our relationship with the Isaias regime in Eritrea is not a warm one. It's been that way since the late 1990s when Eritrea and Ethiopia resumed their conflict. So I think, you would have to take it on a case-by-case basis. Running an embassy does incur some cost. I think it's interesting to look, for example, at the Project 2025 commentary on Africa. It's only a page and a half, and whether or not this reflects the Trump administration's real thinking about Africa, I think it's yet to be seen. But that document did highlight that while we want to put our efforts and our main effort in with our allies and those who share our interests in Africa, and that makes perfect sense, you don't want to completely cut ties with countries where, as Charlie pointed out, regime change is a reality. And I think history has shown that the countries that are first to recognize that change is coming and take advantage of that are the ones who are best positioned for a stronger and more beneficial relationship in the long term. Again, individual embassies, you would have to sit down and kind of do that calculus. But there is a risk in reducing our footprint.
Sure. And this isn't to say that we'd have no capability to actually have diplomatic relations or whatever else we would do as part of a country team. They would simply be, the responsibilities would be moved into a neighboring embassy, correct?
Yes, and that does work, but I think it's important to note, at least in my experience, the idea of regional coverage is attractive at first glance because it saves resources and so forth, but it's never quite effective as it seems when you look at it on paper.
Sure.
It's better than nothing. But it's not the same as having an actual official presence, small or large, in a capital.
Sure. And I think a lot of the rationale is, we have limited resources to do these things. Some of these embassies may not produce the same ROI as others.
Yep. Absolutely.
But the opposite side of that spectrum is we don't need to be involved globally in order to compete with our adversaries. Right. Both arguments have their merits. Both obviously have their, the opposite. I guess writ large, is there, and this is the broad question that goes well past Africa, but it definitely applies here, is in order to compete with China, in order to compete with some of our other global adversaries, do we need to have that global presence? And that obviously would encapsulate African presence as well.
Yeah, I think we do need to have that global presence. And by global presence, I don't mean an embassy in literally every single country in the world or an embassy in multiple consulates. I think some rationalization of our presence goes on with every change in administration, and that's normal, and it needs to be done. But certainly in the case of Africa, while we might not be present in every single country, there are definitely countries that have had a strong and lasting alliance with the United States that have helped us carry out our foreign policy and commercial objectives. And we certainly want to bolster those relationships. And I don't see that changing.
Makes sense. I think some of it has to be a studied reorientation. For instance, we did away with some of the consulates in Africa as we started to open more embassies in Africa.
Right.
Manpower being what it was. I would argue restoring some of those, particularly if we pursue the idea that we are going to be more aggressive about our overseas business interests, our access to critical minerals, etc. You would want, in a country like the Congo, DRC, where Bukavu is literally a continent away from Kinshasa, you'd want a consulate there. You'd want somebody that's paying attention on the ground. Probably a small group, an isolated place like that, you can't function very well. But there's an argument for consulates in some of these African countries. I would argue to service American business if you're going to get in there in a big way, to give you the early warning that somebody bigger needs to intervene to protect American interests in an area. And I just picked on Congo because it's in the headlines, but there are other places where you'd have to consider that kind of thing. We used to have in better times, we used to have a spread of consulates in a place like South Africa. Now, in that case, it was a lot of it to provide citizen services. Adventuresome Americans going into Africa, when it was unusual to go there, needed perhaps to have a consul they could talk to in Durban when they were down to the beach and gotten into a problem. Whereas to try and appeal to Cape Town from Durban for immediate assistance, it's not the same thing. So somebody has to take a hard look at what it is you're exactly after and look at the idea that, if we shut down several of the small embassies where there is no American strategic interest, etc., we should take a look at reusing some of those resources elsewhere, like in a consulate somewhere else.
Makes sense.
I think that same thing applies elsewhere. And I would also argue if you're going to go smaller, it reinforces the need for expertise in the area. It's better to have an Africa Corps that's also trained diplomats that then rotate around these fewer and far between posts, because one of those individuals that won't be an ambassador may be the one that becomes the expert in a place you've closed, if they close Gambia, like Paul said they might, or if they close, just because the country's small, they pick one out of Togo or one of these places. That expertise would be critical to having a man that doesn't have the title ambassador, having the expertise to get the access that's necessary to function in that environment and provide that kind of service. So I think it's not a terrible idea, but it needs to be done in the right fashion.
Right. And the report was that it's just a consideration at this point. And I think it's wise to make the consideration, but obviously conversations like this need to be had.
Yeah. And, there are two things that I think are worth mentioning. Charlie touched on one that's important. They don't grab the headlines the way great power competition or terrorism does, but it is a responsibility of the United States government, like it is the responsibility of every government, and that is the protection of American citizens abroad. And that's a core function of any embassy. Many of these countries don't have large American presence, but it's something worth considering. The second issue, which is certainly relevant in Africa, and its importance will wax and wane with administrations, and that is, of course, humanitarian assistance and the extent to which America has a desire or obligation, however you want to look at it, to address some of those issues in Africa.
Right. I think that's a great segue into one of the more headlined adjustments the Trump administration has made, which is, the dissolution of USAID. That assessing that, I think, requires us to evaluate what the United States' role is in Africa. We mentioned humanitarianism. We mentioned protection of American citizens abroad. Is there, with the dissolution of USAID, are we harming our ability to function in the prudent role the United States has had historically? Or does that role need to be revisited? I think is another question worth asking with these events.
I think that the dissolution of USAID, the rapid way in which it was unwound, probably did generate a bit of shock in Africa. It had been a huge part of our African presence for a long time. I would just say that I hope it doesn't go away altogether. I think a refocus and a rationalization on humanitarian aid is the right way to go. And I hope that capability is not lost or it's even reconstituted, even if it's moved entirely under the State Department. Because I think it is an important part of American soft power. There's certainly a need in Africa, and it's one that I hope we don't completely walk away from.
Sure. Any thoughts?
Part of the reorganization has got to be to take a look at the parts of that aid program that make sense even in this new, more austere environment. The expertise shouldn't be lost, but maybe the way these services are delivered could be different. Maybe the idea is that every one of these programs that, quote, were an emergency program that have managed to hang on for 20 years, 25 years, need from the very beginning to have a built-in end date in order to be justified to Congress or justified in the administration. If I'm going to do program X to improve agriculture, let's pick a random place, in South Sudan, I'm going to do it in a period of 3 years or 5 years, and these are the 3 results I want, as opposed to I'm in there for the long haul because that's the only way I can change things. The idea, the thing that we do better than the Chinese did when they first started doing this thing is we always had the idea that when we sent an expert, he was supposed to work himself out of a job,
right?
To train an African to do it or train an Egyptian to do it or what you're going to do, to bring that idea back in. Emergency response and disaster assistance is a different thing. That's something that I think the American public responds to. They see these pictures on television of something horrible going on, and they want to act. And you need to have the capacity to act, but it doesn't need to be as big as it is. That's only somebody can make that decision having looked at what's going on. One of the wags in the paper this morning, and I forget if it was the Times or the Post, said a criminal example is PEPFAR. Well, what's the E for? Emergency. That emergency has been going on since the George Bush administration. Now, we've been very effective at it, but the objective should have been to stem the problem and then turn around to the Africans and say, we're phasing it out. You need to start providing these particular services, and we'll help you do that. But we're leaving. Maybe the reduced price of the drugs could be a gift on the way out, but we're still leaving. This is something that you, as a sovereign nation, are responsible for, to get that idea back in there. Yeah, it's one thing to feed the hungry, but you can't feed them for decades. It doesn't work.
Yeah. To make sense, I think there's even a bipartisan contention to that point, which is that there are some pros to just staying permanently and providing the PEPFAR permanently. Do you think that any of them merit further consideration? Any of those pros, or what would those be?
Well, if I was looking at, let's look at the medical related programs, the HIV and that kind of thing. If you reorient them, because what happens is a man or a woman can get on a plane in Maputo and be in Chicago in a day's time, having come from the bush somewhere with some brand new disease.
Right.
To turn these programs into American early warning things, who have a side bar of being experts in a particular tropical medicine, whatever it is, and can provide assistance as part of that. But their other focus is back in the United States, so that we have early warning that these things are coming, etc. Again, it goes back to the immigration policy, etc. Better that is, the better your surveillance can work on these kinds of issues. But I think tying it to that makes it more justifiable and probably more effective in the long run. We're also going to get American tourism as these places develop more aggressively, and they're going to be out in the middle of nowhere. Right. And so you want to get that kind of thing. And I'm not picking on Africa. That's true in it. Any number of places where you go out to the outback and there's something different. You know, the Wuhan virus, for instance, here, that idea.
Right. It makes sense. I think, sticking with USAID, sorry, Paul, I think that one of the more generous assessments of what led to the Trump administration coming in and doing what they did is that they got lost in a secondary or even a tertiary mission to make the world better. Great, noble mission, but perhaps not the one that they should have been most invested in. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
I think that's the assessment that's been made. And I think how you pull that back a bit to adjust to realities, where it should have been done and it needs to be done and it hasn't been done. But what of that broken system do you want to save for other reasons? Like you want to be able to have medical forewarning in all these places, access to experimental drugs and things they're doing. Aspirin came out of the Congo because somebody was in the middle of nowhere and ate the bark of the tree. So to dismiss all that because you don't have people out there is to make a mistake. And to give them a reason to be there has to be something more than, I'm just here to be a nice guy and I'm going to protect this, that, or the other thing, your human rights, etc. That's not saleable in the long run. It's certainly saleable in the short run or in a crisis, but in the long run it's not. It needs to be twisted into something more looking forward, I guess, more forecasting, I'd say.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think Charlie makes a great point about being perhaps a little bit more intentional in some of the aid programs to focus on growth, independence, self-sustainability in the part of these African countries that we're helping. And there's no doubt that in AID, as in other government agencies, a certain inertia can take hold. And a fresh look at that, what's working and what doesn't work, was absolutely needed. On some of the other programs, the non-humanitarian programs, some of that I think was perhaps a little bit exaggerated in the media, but certainly there were democracy and governance programs and other things whose efficacy needed to be looked at and re-examined. Africa sometimes can tend to be a place where people feel that they can experiment, that the risks maybe are a little bit less, and one needs to be careful in doing that too frequently in too many places.
Makes sense.
I think the other point, excuse me, Paul, is we can be using other agencies of the U.S. government more effectively. There's no reason that the replacement for the consulate in Bukavu, which was a diplomat, State Department officer, couldn't be a commerce officer who was also specialized a bit in overseas, maybe has given language training, but is there because American business interests there, critical mineral interests are there, etc. Treasury Department and some other places where there's an interest, there's a great deal of loans going on, that kind of, or we're backing up the libido corridor by paying attention to what happens to the dollars we gave. Expertise in finance, etc., that might come out of the Treasury Department might be good in that. Agricultural Department and other areas. For instance, I would argue that one of the reasons, although they don't say it so much in public, that the Qataris and the Saudis and others are pushing into Africa is they're looking for a place to develop a breadbasket because they have their own population problems and they have these huge sovereign wealth funds. And prudence is to buy dirt somewhere. And where's the dirt available and undeveloped in many ways? It's in Africa. The French had a pipe dream in the 50s that they were going to turn the Sud, the southern part of Sudan, into a great agricultural growth. In fact, you used to be able to see this giant canal digging machine that they had shipped there from space. So one of the astronauts reported seeing it. That idea wasn't a bad idea, and I think the Qataris and others are picking up on it. But for us to pay attention to that and be assistant to that, you need an agricultural officer. You don't need a diplomatic officer. You need somebody that can still represent American interests but have the expertise and that kind of thing.
Sure. Do you think that there's any merit to the idea that this, sticking with USAID and the role that the United States plays in humanitarianism and some of these other components of other agencies, a lot of U.S. integration with Africa has been reliant on public diplomacy. Now, one of the arguments for dissolving USAID was that it lost its ability to really be a public diplomat and more of just a gift to nations without a significant ROI. It's being re-rolled right now under State Department. One of the complaints in states is that the public diplomatic field within state has turned into a back corner of an office somewhere that's kind of forgotten about and the key is lost. Do you think that there's merit to the idea that replacing that component within state with USAID and rolling it underneath their roof, so to speak, could help build that presence back in state, especially at a time where they just got rid of the GEC. They just got rid of the Global Engagement Center, which has a public diplomatic presence. Do you think that rolling USAID underneath that could actually help if done right?
I think it could, and I hate to say it, but I think to some degree that ship sailed. When they did away with the whole communications operation, there was a point at which all those officers were going to be reprogrammed into the State Department function. There was a big internal battle over should they be parsed out into the bureaus, so that in, like the regional affairs office like I had, you had had two of those people who were the guys that made VOA work and these other things work right in the bureau, so that the idea of press presentation and, if you will, American propaganda, if you will, was right in the bureau itself. So it wasn't seen as alien and it would become more natural for them to do it. They went the other way and kept it as a separate entity. I think the aid business may be a chance to take a look at that and say, if we're going to put aid back in here, it needs to have its functional capacity here, but it also needs to have its, if you will, current fine motor skills in the actual bureau. So spread some of those aid people, just like the labor officers, when we did more of that, were scattered among the bureaus, so that there was an expert there that if you wanted to talk to a union somewhere, good news, some guy that had been a United Auto Worker union boss had spent 5 years as a state contractor. He or she could put out to do that. I think they need to look at that kind of thing too. We've got this asset. Maybe it's smaller than, some people would like it to be, but let's use it more effectively. If you continue to put them into a silo of excellence, well, the only thing they do is aid. How is that going to change the impact? Whereas they could make a difference elsewhere. Right. Manpower is manpower.
I think there's one aspect of public diplomacy that, in my experience, I found particularly effective, and also one that's very cost effective. And it's something I hope we don't walk away from or could even find a way to enhance. And that is visitor programs, where we help sponsor educational opportunities for up-and-coming leaders in Africa. That can have a profoundly positive and long-lasting effect. And it's something that over and over we've seen, not just in Africa, but around the world, leaders who have had the opportunity early in their career to get a degree or an education in the United States, not in huge numbers or anything like that, but targeted, again, to people who have a strong future ahead of them, can be a very effective way to generate goodwill toward the United States in a way that benefits us for the long term down the road.
That makes sense. And that's something that the United States is not alone in realizing. Sure. This is something that our adversaries realize too. I mean, ever since the 50s, even there have been military visitors to colleges in Beijing. There have been, especially in Southern Africa, members of those government organizations that trained with the KGB and trained with other institutions.
I'll give you an interesting example, and for listeners who are interested, he's done a podcast on his career and on his background. But Wilson Boynet, who in many ways I think is kind of the father of the modern Kenyan intelligence service, did a 1-year stint at the National Defense University. In fact, his picture's on the wall there as one of the honorary graduates of that institution. And he talks in his podcast about how valuable he found that experience. And I think there's no doubt in my mind that it inclined him to view the United States in a favorable light as he went on to occupy a very important job in a very important country.
Right. So aid programs are diminishing in Africa right now. Visitor programs, don't think they're really in question yet, but potentially they'd be on the menu. One of the main concerns of the dissolution of USAID and some of these other programs is that it continues to exacerbate the problem that most Africans see, which is the reason we go to the Chinese is just because the Americans aren't here. Or if they are here, they're giving us products that we don't want. I mean, most African states are still very traditional, and we've maybe skipped a few steps. I think is a generous way to put it, in offering them, instead of infrastructure, here's how to deal with LGBTQ rights. Maybe you guys need to invest more in abortions and other reproductive health options, so to speak. Are these new changes a continuation of that same pattern where we're absent, therefore China is going to come in and fill the gap, or Russia or Turkey or the UAE? Madlib fill in the gap at that point.
Well, I think that is happening. It's more evident in some countries than in others in Africa. But certainly China has shifted more from infrastructure, although they're continuing to do that, to more of this military and security education. And yeah, I think part of that is that there aren't as many opportunities here in the United States. We may never be able to match China with its sheer volume, but again, in a very targeted way, it can be a very effective tool for the United States.
Do you think that there is merit, Dr. Snyder, to that argument that now that USAID is pausing a lot of its humanitarian efforts in Africa, I shouldn't say USAID, the United States at this point, is it so simple as that the Chinese will just come in and replace us and everybody will be Chinese-loving African citizens, or is it a little bit more complicated than that?
Yeah, I don't think the Chinese have any intention to come in and replace us one for one on these kinds of programs. It's not part of their strategic long-run plan, and I don't think they'll vary from it for that purpose. I mean, they'll exploit opportunity if they can deliver in some kind of crisis where we don't, especially showing off their newfound blue water navy. Right. And to do some of that, they'll do it. But that's more opportunistic as opposed to strategic. And I don't think they have any idea of replacing us in that. They don't want to be the big power in Africa. They want to be the business power in Africa. And they want access for what they need. They want the critical minerals. They want the markets. But they don't necessarily need everyone to love the Chinese.
Right.
They don't need that. It may happen, but they don't need that. And I think that's a different objective, and a way they'll exploit it. It won't be a one-for-one quickly replacing us in that kind of thing. The Cubans, for instance, when they pulled all the way back out of Africa, left behind a large medical presence. It's still there. Why is it still there? Because that's how the Cubans saw themselves. And it's an area they had the ability to function in, and they could live in local areas that more sophisticated Western types wouldn't want to live in for long periods of time. It was in a national interest as they saw it. I don't think the Chinese see it that way, because the Cuban presence was ideological and a remnant of that old period. The Chinese presence, I think, is different. Yes, they want to prove that the Chinese miracle is reproducible.
Sure.
And that their mercantilistic kind of system can be a way to grow rapidly, which is the thing that they're selling as they sell their goods and services. Our model is the one that works too.
Right.
Look at the factories we built. And you can make the case, if you look at the explosion in population in Africa, where is the cheap labor going to be in the future? It's in China now, but they're rising up into the middle class. So the cheap labor phenomenon won't last forever in China. The new population that may turn into the cheap labor may be in Africa. And do the Chinese see that? Are they transferring the skills to make it possible to build, pick your favorite Chinese TV sets or Chinese car in Africa as a replacement and retain the profit, not unlike we do in many cases? It's too soon to make that judgment because we've just done this pullback.
Right. Do you feel, you mentioned that it seems like there has been a evolution from what could have been an ideological bend to Chinese engagement there, or even Russian engagement there, to today where it seems a little bit more pragmatic. But that's not to say that those things don't happen. I mean, we have Tanzania, we have Ghana, you have Nyerere and Nkrumah that were both very obviously Maoist leaders. Do you think that there's still room for something like that that China could capitalize on, or do you think that we're just too far past that at this point?
I think Africa's evolved past that. I don't think that that approach is attractive to them anymore. I think they're at the point where the population now is more effective, and as effective as here in the United States and other places, at making demands for progress in areas like the economy and that kind of thing, medical care, education, etc. And that's an area in which the Chinese have the ability to show mass production if they're asked for it. I don't think you see them push it. It'll be there if that's the price of getting some of those critical minerals. You want us to do a few school buildings, that kind of show will do that.
Right.
I think we started to pick up on that idea too with the libido corridor access thing, where for the first time in a long time, the United States is doing infrastructure. And we're doing infrastructure to get at critical minerals, where we're taking an existing African system and exploiting it to put it through a port, etc. Sure. I think the downside that people haven't looked at yet is, why is libido so interesting in the longer run? All the gas in Angola is flared around the port of Libido. So the beginnings of crude manufacture, in terms of let's take cobalt or something, instead of shipping raw cobalt out, the first stage, because of the huge sources of cheap energy, could happen in Libido, which is an advancement for the African continent. I think you're going to see more African leaders pushing for that, seeing that what's happening here is they're shipping raw material, and we'll never develop that way. It has to be something more refined. It may not be a finished product, but it might be an intermediate product, particularly when you're talking about critical minerals, etc. And I think there'd be a big advantage to us for looking at that in a hard way. Not only do we want access to your mind, we'll also transfer some of the skills so that instead of shipping raw ore, let's say,
sure,
we'll ship more processed ore. So we're shipping more effectively to be used more quickly, taking a step off our backs, putting it on yours, but you can make money at it and develop your own expertise, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's the next phase in this development. I think particularly if the Trump administration continues to pursue the policies they did the first time, prosper Africa, which was really, you prosper, but so do we. And that's why the Development Bank changed into the new finance instrument that it is, et cetera. And some of those other ideas that first administration had might make a difference as they actually start to execute them. Don't forget, they've only been back for 2 months. So, yeah, you can't really judge them quite yet.
Sure.
I might judge in 4 months, but not 3 months.
Not 2. It begs, there's an interest question here. I was hoping to eventually get to just a survey of what are the specific American interests in Africa, but I think now is a great time to talk about Angola. You don't seem to be concerned that the libido corridor could bite us in the rear at some point. I mean, we talked about processing, for example. I think the average, according to, I think it was the U.S. Geological Survey, talks about how, or some tangential agency talks about how it takes an average of 29 years for a processing plant to be developed here in the United States, mostly because of environmental regulations and environmental impact assessments and the like. Most processing is done in China. So theoretically, you build this railway, it goes over to Libido from Zambia and the DRC. Do they then go around the Cape of good hope and go back to China and process it? Or what are some developments that need to happen in order for us to really capitalize on libido?
Well, I think the reason we built the railroad going in that direction is exactly to prevent.
Right. If we don't do it, they will.
They will. And I don't doubt for a mind, I saw some things in some African papers that I read, that there's the beginnings of a Chinese effort to do some railroad work, maybe to catch up at the other end.
Yeah, the Desire Railway through Dar es Salaam.
And or did do Dar es Salaam or down through Mozambique to Beira, depending on which branch they're on, or maybe both branches. There's no reason you can't do that, because there are also minerals up along this way, rare earths, etc. And that whole thing is a part, we need to get into this game and see what's possible. And it's in our interest, etc. Because I think it's inevitable that at some point there'll be development. But we are now, for strategic reasons, finally starting to respond to this total lack of refining ability. The first nickel refining plant got itself opened in Oklahoma. It's kind of a pilot plant. But that idea, I think you'll see spread to these other, them giant battery factories that Elon Musk is building. That idea in the United States to have a more finished product, it has to be done here. Otherwise, we could be cut off in a crisis.
Sure.
It's not a shooting war. What about a blockade?
Right.
One of the arguments has always been that why would the Chinese invade Taiwan when they could blockade it and go over to you?
Right.
That processing, nickel processing plant in Oklahoma, I think there's another one that's in Louisiana that was sourcing directly from, I believe it was Mozambique, but it stopped suddenly through force majeure. I mean, there was no physical capacity anymore for us to secure our ability to get the nickel to Louisiana to be processed, or whatever process was taking place. Is that something that the United States uniquely is less equipped to handle, or is this something that is kind of an equalizer between all of the different competitors there?
I think they all face the same problem. I think that's why you saw the Chinese equivalent of private military companies develop on the West Coast to protect their assets. That's the reason executive outcomes came into being way back at the end of the Cold War, when they were protecting assets for mining interests, in not just South Africa, but in Europe, etc. They developed, because there has to be somebody on the ground to provide protection. And it needs to be a hard level of protection in some cases.
Sure.
And we can, by taking our, if you will, our foot off the neck of our own private military companies, allow them in this search for critical minerals to be more free to operate, etc., with less restraint, because we'll never tolerate with that. The first time some small village is wiped out because somebody went nuts on a private military company, they'll be held to pay. But to begin to lighten it up enough that makes it possible for us to compete in that.
Right. That makes sense. Paul, is there anything you want to add? And then I want to kind of dig into Angola. I know that Professor Snyder's had some experience there that would be useful to talk about.
No, nothing really to add to that. I think to the extent to which some of the processing capacity can be recreated and established in the United States, it makes all the things we've been talking about, access to the raw materials, all that more relevant. So over the long term, Africa will play a role in that. Didn't make as much sense when we weren't doing any of the refining here in the United States. If that really happens and really picks up, then we're going to need sources of that raw material. So things like the Libido corridor, the recent engagement that the Trump administration had with the government in Kinshasa about access to that country's minerals, it all makes a good deal of sense.
Thank you for joining us for part 1 of our series on Africa with Professor Kepp and Dr. Snyder. Join us next week for part 2. Thanks.
If you like our podcast and would like to hear more, please subscribe. And if you are interested in learning more about the topics we covered here today and want to be a student at IWP, go to iwp.edu and click Apply Now.